Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Growing up in Millfield, Nebraska meant everyone knew everyone's business, and Halloween 2018 was supposed to be just another night of harmless fun for me and my best friend Tyler. We were 17, seniors at Millfield High, and had built quite the reputation for our elaborate pranks. Nothing malicious, just the kind of stuff that made people laugh once they got over the initial shock. That October night started like any other, with us meeting at Tyler's garage around 8:30. Our backpacks loaded with toilet paper, silly string, and plastic lawn ornaments we'd collected from yard sales throughout the year. The air had that perfect autumn chill that made your breath visible, and the streets were alive with kids in costumes going door to door. We'd already hit a few houses. Coach Peterson's truck got the plastic flamingo treatment, and Mrs. Henderson's front yard was now decorated with about 30 garden gnomes we'd been stockpiling since summer. But then, Tyler suggested we pay a visit to Mr. Garrison's place on Elm Street, and even though every instinct told me it was a bad idea, the thrill of targeting the neighborhood's most notorious hard-ass was too tempting to pass up. Harold Garrison was the self-appointed neighborhood watch coordinator, a Vietnam vet in his late 60s who took his duties way too seriously. The guy would patrol the streets at night with a flashlight, documenting every minor infraction in a leather-bound notebook. Kids skateboarding after dark, cars parked slightly over the curb, trash cans left out too long. He'd moved to Millfield about 3 years prior, and from day one, he'd made it his mission to impose his own brand of order on our quiet town. His house stood out like a fortress among the modest ranch homes, security cameras on every corner, motion sensor lights that could blind you from 50 feet away, and a chain-link fence he'd installed himself, complete with no trespassing signs every 10 feet. Tyler's plan was simple enough. We'd toilet paper his prized oak tree in the front yard, arrange our collection of lawn ornaments in compromising positions on his perfectly manicured grass, and maybe leave a few fake tombstones with funny epitaphs like "Here lies fun" or "Rip sense of humor." Standard teenage stuff, nothing that couldn't be cleaned up in 20 minutes. We approached from the alley behind his house, cutting through the Johnsons' backyard to avoid the street cameras we knew he monitored religiously. The first weird thing I noticed was that his motion sensors didn't activate when we crossed into his property. Tyler whispered that maybe the old man had finally gone to bed early for once, but something about the darkness of his usually lit-up yard made my skin prickle. We crept along the fence line, staying low, our sneakers barely making a sound on the damp grass. That's when I spotted the first trap, a barely visible wire stretched between two stakes about ankle height, connected to what looked like tin cans filled with something that rattled. The realization that Garrison had actually booby-trapped his yard hit me like ice water in the face, but Tyler was already committed, carefully stepping over the wire and motioning for me to follow. As we moved deeper into the yard, more traps revealed themselves in the moonlight, boards with nails sticking up hidden under leaves, what appeared to be bear traps, though I prayed they were just the fake ones from the hunting store, and more tripwires crisscrossing the lawn in a maze-like pattern. The smart thing would have been to turn around right then, to forget the whole stupid prank and go home, but teenage pride and the adrenaline pumping through my veins kept me moving forward. We'd made it about halfway to the oak tree when I saw him. Garrison was sitting in a lawn chair on his darkened porch, so still I'd mistaken him for a shadow. The moonlight caught the metal of something in his lap, and my heart nearly stopped when I realized it was a shotgun, resting across his thighs like he was waiting for deer season to open right there in his suburban front yard. Tyler must have seen him at the same moment because he grabbed my arm so hard I nearly yelped. We stood there, frozen in the middle of the old man's yard, surrounded by his psychotic obstacle course, with nowhere to go that wouldn't make noise or trigger something. Garrison hadn't moved yet, but I could see his head was tilted slightly in our direction, like he was listening. The man was wearing what looked like old military fatigues, and night vision goggles pushed up on his forehead caught the pale light. My mouth went completely dry as I realized this wasn't some cranky old neighbor trying to scare kids. This was something else entirely, something that had crossed way over the line from protective to predatory. The slight click of him cocking the shotgun echoed across the yard like thunder, and his voice, when it came, was calm and steady, in a way that made every hair on my body stand up. "I know you're there, boys. Been expecting you all week. Why don't you come on out where I can see you better?" Neither of us moved, and I could feel Tyler trembling beside me, his usual confidence completely evaporated. Garrison stood up slowly, the chair creaking under his weight, and took a step forward into the moonlight. His face was painted with dark streaks, camouflage paint, I realized with growing horror, and his eyes had this vacant, thousand-yard stare that made him look like he was seeing something beyond his suburban lawn. "You know what we did to Charlie in the jungle?" he continued, his voice conversational, almost friendly. "We'd set up perimeters just like this, wait for them to come sneaking in at night. Of course, those were different times, different rules." He lifted the shotgun to his shoulder, not quite aiming at us, but making the threat crystal clear. "But trespassing is trespassing, and a man's got a right to defend his property. Police might take 20 minutes to get here. Lot can happen in 20 minutes. The way he said it, like he was explaining the weather, made my knees feel like water. This wasn't the angry shouting I'd expected if we got caught. This was calculated, prepared, like he'd been planning for this exact scenario. That's when Tyler made the mistake of trying to run. He pivoted hard to the left, heading for the side gate, and immediately triggered one of the tripwires. The cans erupted in a cacophony of metal on metal. Garrison had filled them with ball bearings or marbles, and Tyler went down hard, crying out as his knee connected with something sharp hidden in the grass. The sound that came out of Garrison wasn't quite a laugh, more like a satisfied grunt, and he swung the shotgun in Tyler's direction. "See, that's what happens when you don't watch where you're going. This whole yard is a classroom, boys, and you just failed your first lesson." I dropped to help Tyler, who was clutching his knee and whimpering, blood already soaking through his jeans. The old man took another step closer, and I could smell him now. Gun oil, stale coffee, and something medicinal, like the pills my grandfather took for his nerves. "You got two choices," he said, his voice dropping lower. "You can try to run again, see how far you get before you hit something worse than a little wire. Or you can sit right there and learn what happens to people who don't respect boundaries." My mind was racing, trying to find a way out of this insanity, when I remembered the cell phone in my pocket. Moving as slowly as possible, I slipped my hand down and managed to dial 911 without looking, praying the dispatcher would hear enough to send help. "Mr. Garrison," I tried, my voice cracking like I was 13 again. "We're sorry, okay? We were just going to toilet paper your tree. It's Halloween, just a stupid prank. We'll leave right now, never come back, I swear." But he wasn't listening. Or maybe he was hearing something else entirely. His eyes had gone glassy, and he was muttering under his breath about sectors and Charlie and securing the perimeter. The shotgun barrel wavered between us like he was having trouble deciding which target to focus on. "You think this is a game?" he suddenly roared, making both of us flinch. "You think you can just walk onto a man's property, in the dark, dressed in black like some kind of insurgent?" That's when I noticed the small speakers hidden in the bushes start playing sounds, recorded jungle noises, insects, and distant gunfire. This wasn't just about catching pranksters. Garrison had turned his yard into some twisted recreation of whatever hell he'd lived through 50 years ago. The sound of sirens in the distance was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard, but it seemed to trigger something in Garrison. His whole body went rigid, and he started shouting military commands to people who weren't there. "Johnson, get on that 50 cal. Martinez, cover the north entrance." He spun around, pointing the shotgun at shadows, and that's when I saw our chance. I hauled Tyler to his feet, throwing his arm over my shoulder, and we stumbled toward the front gate while Garrison was distracted by his phantom squad. We'd made it maybe 10 feet when he wheeled back around, raising the shotgun to his shoulder. "Deserters!" he screamed. "You don't leave your post! You don't abandon your brothers!" The muzzle flash lit up the yard like lightning, and the boom of the gun was deafening. Wood chips exploded from the fence post inches from my head, and Tyler screamed. But we kept moving, adrenaline overriding everything else. Another shot rang out, this one going high, shattering a window in the house across the street. The sirens were getting closer, and I could see red and blue lights painting the trees at the end of the block. We burst through the gate just as 2 police cars screeched to a halt in front of Garrison's house, officers jumping out with weapons drawn. "Drop the weapon, drop it now!" they shouted, and for a terrifying moment I thought the old man might start shooting at them too. But something in their presence seemed to snap him back to reality, at least partially. The shotgun clattered to the porch, and Garrison sank to his knees, his hands going to his head. "Secure the perimeter," he kept mumbling. "Charlie's in the wire, they're in the wire." The cops moved in carefully, one covering while the other approached, and I heard the metallic click of handcuffs. Tyler and I collapsed on the neighbor's lawn, both of us shaking uncontrollably. His knee was pretty torn up, and the paramedics who arrived shortly after immediately started working on him. I gave my statement to Officer Daniels, who I recognized from school safety presentations, while watching them lead Garrison away. The old man looked smaller somehow, confused, like he didn't understand why he was being arrested for defending his forward operating base from enemy combatants. The aftermath was surreal in its own way. The entire Millfield Police Department spent hours documenting and dismantling Garrison's elaborate trap system, finding things we hadn't even noticed in the dark. Pungy stick pits covered with false grass, fishing line connected to air horns, and what turned out to be very real bear traps, though thankfully not armed. They found a whole command center in his basement, with monitors showing feeds from dozens of hidden cameras, detailed maps of the neighborhood with defensive positions marked, and journals filled with paranoid observations about potential threats. Tyler needed 11 stitches in his knee and spent the night in the hospital for observation. I was physically fine except for some scratches and a ringing in my ears from the gunshots. But I didn't sleep for 3 days straight. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that vacant stare, heard that calm voice talking about what could happen in 20 minutes. My parents were a mix of furious and terrified, grounding me until Christmas while simultaneously hugging me every time I walked into a room. The story spread through Millfield like wildfire, growing more exaggerated with each telling until some versions had us dodging machine gun fire and climbing through barbed wire. The truth was disturbing enough without embellishment. Garrison was charged with assault with a deadly weapon, reckless endangerment, and about a dozen other things I can't remember. But instead of prison, he ended up in a psychiatric facility after the evaluation revealed severe PTSD with psychotic features. Turns out, he'd been off his medication for months, convinced that they were monitoring him through the pills. His sister came from Ohio to handle his affairs, and she found records showing he'd been calling the VA crisis line almost nightly, reporting insurgent activity in suburban Nebraska. The house on Elm Street stood empty for months, the for sale sign eventually growing weathered and tilted. Nobody wanted to buy the fortress where the neighborhood watch went way too wrong. Tyler and I never pulled another prank after that night. We graduated, went to different colleges, and slowly lost touch the way people do. But every Halloween, when I see kids running through the streets with their bags of candy, I remember that sometimes the real monsters aren't wearing costumes. They're sitting in the dark waiting for someone to cross their line. Working as a journalist in small-town Iowa wasn't exactly what I'd envisioned when I graduated from journalism school 5 years ago. But Cedar Falls had grown on me, the kind of place where everyone knew your coffee order at the diner and Friday night football games were the social event of the week. I'd been covering local stories for the Cedar Falls Gazette since 2019, mostly town council meetings and high school sports. Nothing that would make headlines beyond our county lines. That all changed on a humid Tuesday morning in August when my editor Frank dropped a folder on my desk with a look that meant something big had happened. The Willowbrook care home had shut down overnight. No warning, no explanation. just a hastily posted sign on the front door, and confused families showing up to find their loved ones had been transferred to facilities in neighboring counties. Frank wanted me to write a simple piece about the closure and where residents had been relocated, but something about the whole situation made my journalist instincts kick into overdrive. I'd driven past Willowbrook countless times on my way to cover stories on the north side of town. The building always looked well maintained from the outside, with its cheerful yellow paint and manicured gardens. But now, less than 24 hours after closing, the windows were already boarded up, and a chain-link fence had appeared around the property. Who moves that fast to seal off a building unless they're trying to hide something? I spent the rest of that morning making calls, trying to piece together what had happened. The state health department claimed they had no record of any violations that would warrant an immediate closure. The mayor's office directed me to the care home's parent company, Midwest Senior Solutions, but their phone lines were mysteriously experiencing technical difficulties. Every door I knocked on seemed to slam shut before I could even get my foot in. By lunchtime, I'd managed to track down 3 families whose relatives had been residents at Willowbrook. Each one told me the same strange story. They'd received a call around 4 a.m. saying their loved one was being transferred due to unforeseen circumstances. No further details, no chance to ask questions. Just a facility name and address scribbled down in the middle of the night. It was Beverly Mitchell who gave me my first real lead. I found her sitting on her porch, clutching a photo of her mother, Eleanor. She invited me in for iced tea, and as we sat in her kitchen with its checkered tablecloth and the smell of fresh-baked cookies, she told me something that made every hair on my arm stand up. "My mother called me 3 weeks ago," Beverly said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She was crying, begging me to get her out of there. Said the night staff was doing things, horrible things. But when I visited the next day, she didn't remember calling me at all. The administrator, Mr. Brennan, said she'd been having episodes of confusion. I believed him then. God help me, I believed him." She pushed a manila envelope across the table toward me. Inside were photos her mother had somehow managed to take with an old disposable camera. Images that would haunt me for months to come. The photos were grainy and poorly lit, clearly taken in secret during the late hours. The first few showed elderly residents strapped to their beds with what looked like industrial restraints, not medical ones. Their mouths were open in silent screams, eyes wide with terror. But it was the other photos that made me excuse myself to Beverly's bathroom, where I gripped the sink and tried not to vomit. There were images of staff members, their faces obscured by shadows, force-feeding residents some kind of thick gray substance from unmarked containers. One photo showed a room I'd never seen in any care home before, walls lined with medical equipment that looked more suited to a laboratory than a facility for the elderly. The last photo was the most disturbing. It showed Eleanor herself, standing in what appeared to be a basement corridor, pointing at a heavy metal door marked with biohazard symbols. On the back of the photo, in shaky handwriting, she'd written, "They take them down here when they stop responding to the treatments. They never come back up." I left Beverly's house with the photos tucked safely in my bag and a determination burning in my chest. This wasn't just negligence or standard abuse. Something far more sinister had been happening at Willowbrook. I drove straight to the newspaper office, my mind racing with questions. What kind of treatments? Why the biohazard symbols? And most importantly, where were the residents who went down to that basement and never returned? I needed to get inside that building before whoever was behind this had time to destroy the evidence. But as I pulled into the Gazette's parking lot, I noticed something that made my throat tighten. A black sedan with tinted windows was parked across the street, the same one I'd seen outside Beverly's house. Someone was already watching me, and I'd barely scratched the surface of this story. That evening, I worked late at the office, digitizing Eleanor's photos and backing them up in multiple locations. Frank had gone home hours ago, leaving me alone with the hum of computers and the occasional creak of the old building settling. Around 9 p.m., I was startled by a knock at the main door. Through the glass, I could see a woman in her 30s, wearing scrubs and looking nervously around. She introduced herself as Sarah Chen, a former nurse at Willowbrook. "I heard you were asking questions," she said, her voice trembling. "I worked the night shift for 2 years. I quit last month because I couldn't take it anymore." She glanced at the street before continuing. They were running some kind of experiment. The residents, they were test subjects. Dr. Reeves called it Project Sunset. They said it was research on dementia treatments, but the medications they gave them. People changed. Some became violent, others just empty, like their souls had been sucked out, and the ones who had adverse reactions. She trailed off, unable to finish. Sarah agreed to meet me the next morning at a truck stop outside town to share more details and documentation she'd secretly copied. But when I arrived at the designated spot at dawn, I found her car in the parking lot, driver's door open, engine still running. Her purse was on the passenger seat along with a folder marked Willowbrook Evidence. But Sarah was gone. The security footage would later show her walking toward a van that had pulled up beside her car. Then nothing. She simply vanished. Inside the folder, I found patient charts with coded entries, shipping manifests for unmarked pharmaceutical supplies, and a list of residents who had been transferred over the past year. Cross-referencing with obituaries, I discovered that every single person on that list had supposedly died within weeks of their transfer, all from natural causes. The death certificates were all signed by the same doctor, Dr. Marcus Reeves, Willowbrook's medical director. The threat started that same afternoon. First, it was my car tires, all 4 slashed while I was inside the library researching Dr. Reeves. Then came the phone calls to my apartment, always from different numbers. No voice, just the sound of labored breathing and what sounded like medical equipment beeping in the background. But it was the package left on my doorstep that truly terrified me. Inside was a photo of me taken that morning at the truck stop, along with a single pill, gray and unmarked, just like the substance in Eleanor's photos. The note attached read, "Some stories are better left untold. This is your only warning." I knew I should stop, should hand everything over to the FBI and walk away. But I kept thinking about Sarah, about Eleanor, about all those residents who disappeared into that basement. They deserved justice, and I was possibly the only person who could give it to them. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I called my cousin Greg, who worked in construction and owed me a favor from when I helped clear his name in a bar fight story. We met at midnight behind Willowbrook. The building was dark except for a single light in what I now knew was the basement. Greg cut through the fence and we slipped inside through a loading dock door that hadn't been properly secured. The smell hit us immediately. A mixture of industrial disinfectant and something else, something organic and wrong. We made our way through empty hallways, past abandoned rooms still containing personal belongings hastily left behind. The residents' artwork still hung on the walls, cheerful paintings that seemed grotesque in the darkness. As we descended the stairs to the basement, the temperature dropped noticeably, and that strange smell grew stronger. What we found down there would make even the photos Eleanor took seem tame by comparison. The basement was a maze of corridors and rooms that shouldn't have existed in a standard care home. The first room we entered was filled with medical equipment I couldn't identify, machines with tubes and wires, monitoring devices still blinking with data, and refrigeration units humming ominously. Greg found a logbook on one of the tables, its pages filled with entries about subjects identified only by numbers. The entries detailed dosages, behavioral changes, and physical symptoms that read like something from a horror novel. Subject 47 had developed unprecedented cellular regeneration, but accompanying psychosis. Subject 23 showed complete memory dissolution within 72 hours of initial dose. But it was the final entries that made us both stop breathing. They mentioned a containment breach 3 days before the facility's closure, and subjects 12, 31, and 45 unaccounted for. As we stood there processing this information, we heard it, a sound that definitely shouldn't have been there. Footsteps slow and shuffling coming from deeper in the basement. We should have run right then. Every instinct screamed at us to get out, but I needed more evidence. I grabbed the logbook and several vials from the refrigeration unit while Greg kept watch. The footsteps were getting closer, accompanied by a low moaning sound that made my skin crawl. We backed toward the stairs, but then a figure emerged from the shadows. It was an elderly man in a hospital gown, but something was terribly wrong with him. His skin had a grayish tint, and his eyes were completely white, no pupils or irises visible. He moved with jerky, unnatural movements, like a marionette with tangled strings. Behind him, we could see more figures approaching. Greg grabbed my arm and we ran, taking the stairs 3 at a time. We could hear them following, that horrible shuffling sound echoing through the stairwell. We burst through the loading dock and didn't stop running until we reached Greg's truck. As we sped away, I looked back to see several figures standing at the fence, watching us with those empty white eyes. The next morning, I didn't go to the office. Instead, I drove straight to the FBI field office in Des Moines with everything I'd collected: Eleanor's photos, Sarah's documents, the logbook, and the vials. Agent Patricia Russo listened to my story with growing concern, especially when their lab confirmed the vials contained an experimental compound not registered with any pharmaceutical database. Within hours, a full investigation team was mobilized. They found Willowbrook exactly as Greg and I had left it, including the transformed resident still wandering the basement. It turned out Dr. Reeves had been running unauthorized trials for a shadow pharmaceutical company, using elderly residents as test subjects for a drug meant to reverse cognitive decline. Instead, it had caused horrific mutations and psychological breaks. The 3 unaccounted-for subjects were found living in the building's sub-basement, kept alive by automated feeding systems, but no longer recognizably human. The story broke nationally 2 weeks later, after the FBI had secured the scene and rescued the surviving victims. Dr. Reeves was arrested at a private airfield trying to flee the country. Midwest Senior Solutions was revealed to be a shell company funded by offshore accounts linked to illegal human experimentation rings. Sarah Chen was found alive but heavily sedated in a warehouse in Missouri. She'd been kidnapped to prevent her from talking, but survived thanks to our quick action. The transformed residents were transferred to a specialized CDC facility, where researchers worked to reverse the drug's effects with limited success. As for me, I won a Pulitzer for investigative journalism, but I've never been able to forget those white eyes staring at us through the fence. Willowbrook was demolished 6 months later, the ground sealed with concrete. They built a memorial garden there with names of all the victims. Sometimes I visit Eleanor's marker and leave flowers, grateful that her courage in taking those photos had helped expose the truth. The nightmares have mostly stopped now, but I still can't walk past a care home without wondering what might be happening behind those cheerful facades. People keep asking me why I moved away from Pine Ridge so suddenly, why I left a decent job, why I won't talk about what happened that night in March 2018. The truth is, some things are better left buried, but the nightmares won't stop, and maybe telling this story will help me sleep again. I was 22 then, working nights at Murphy's Corner store to pay for community college classes during the day. Pine Ridge, Pennsylvania, population 3,400, was the kind of place where nothing ever happened, where the biggest news was usually Mrs. Hendrix's prize-winning tomatoes or the high school football team making it to regionals. I'd grown up there, knew every face, every family drama, every secret that wasn't really secret, except for the Ashworth family secrets, which were locked away tighter than Fort Knox. The Ashworths owned everything that mattered in Pine Ridge. Vincent Ashworth had been mayor for over a decade. His lumber mill employed half the town, and his wife Catherine chaired every charity event and town committee. Their son Nathaniel was a senior at Pine Ridge High, star quarterback, honor roll student, the golden boy who could do no wrong in anyone's eyes. I'd graduated with his older sister Emma, and even then, the family had this untouchable quality, like they existed in a different stratosphere from the rest of us. Vincent drove a pristine black Cadillac Escalade. Catherine piloted a white BMW, and Nathaniel had just gotten a brand new silver Mustang for his 18th birthday. On Wednesday night, March 14th, 2018, I was halfway through my shift when I heard the screech of tires and the sickening thud that would change everything. Murphy's Corner Store sat right at the intersection of Main Street and Birch Avenue, with big windows that gave me a clear view of the whole downtown area. It was around 11:30 p.m., dead quiet except for the hum of the refrigerators and the occasional car passing through. I was restocking the candy aisle when I heard tires screaming against asphalt, followed by this horrible wet sound, like a watermelon being dropped from a height. My head snapped up just in time to see a silver car speed through the intersection, brake lights flashing as it disappeared down Birch Avenue toward the wealthy side of town. What made my chest tighten wasn't just the hit and run I'd apparently witnessed, but the unmistakable outline of that silver Mustang I'd seen Nathaniel driving around town for the past month. There was a body lying motionless in the crosswalk, and I knew with absolute certainty that the mayor's golden boy had just killed someone. The victim turned out to be Eddie Kowalski, a 63-year-old maintenance worker who'd been walking home from his late shift at the elementary school. Eddie was one of those guys everyone liked. Quiet, hardworking, always had a smile and a wave when you saw him around town. He'd been crossing at the designated crosswalk, probably never saw it coming. I called 911 immediately, my voice shaking as I reported the hit and run, but I didn't mention seeing the Mustang. Something told me to keep that detail to myself for now. Maybe because I knew how powerful the Ashworth family was, or maybe because I wanted to be absolutely sure before I accused the mayor's son of vehicular homicide. The ambulance arrived within minutes, followed by Police Chief Williams and Deputy Rodriguez, but it was too late for Eddie. As they loaded his covered body into the coroner's van, I noticed Vincent Ashworth's black Escalade pulling up to the scene, which struck me as odd since he didn't usually show up to crime scenes unless they were major incidents affecting the whole town. What happened next still gives me chills. Vincent stepped out of his Escalade wearing a perfectly pressed suit despite the late hour, like he'd been expecting this call. He walked straight to Chief Williams, and I watched them have what looked like an intense whispered conversation near the police cruiser. Williams kept nodding and glancing around nervously, while Vincent's posture remained calm and authoritative. At one point, Vincent pulled out his phone and made a call, speaking quietly but with obvious urgency. The whole interaction lasted maybe 10 minutes, but there was something deeply wrong about it. The mayor should have been asking questions, showing concern for the victim, making statements about finding the perpetrator. Instead, it looked like he was giving orders. When Chief Williams walked back to where Deputy Rodriguez was taking measurements and photos, I saw him shake his head and say something that made Rodriguez stop what he was doing and put away his camera. The strangest part came around 1 a.m., about an hour and a half after the accident. I was giving my statement to Deputy Rodriguez when a tow truck pulled up, not Murphy's Towing, which handled all the city contracts but some outfit from 3 towns over that I'd never seen before. The driver hooked up what looked like a severely damaged silver car that had been parked behind the municipal building, completely out of sight from the main street. Even in the dim lighting, I could see the front end was completely smashed in, headlight dangling by wires, and there was something dark splattered across the hood that made my stomach turn. The weird thing was, nobody seemed surprised by this. Chief Williams just nodded at the tow truck driver like it was all planned, and Vincent Ashworth watched the whole thing from his Escalade with this eerily calm expression. As the truck drove away with what I was certain was Nathaniel's Mustang, Vincent made another phone call, and within minutes, a gleaming replacement silver Mustang was being driven up by some guy in coveralls who handed the keys to Vincent and disappeared into a waiting pickup truck. By 2 a.m., the scene was completely cleared. No police tape, no chalk outlines, no evidence markers, nothing to indicate that a man had died there just hours before. The intersection looked exactly like it had before Eddie Kowalski took his final walk home. When I asked Deputy Rodriguez if they had any leads on the hit-and-run driver, he gave me this uncomfortable look and mumbled something about it being an ongoing investigation. But I could tell from his expression that there wasn't going to be any investigation. The next morning, the Pine Ridge Gazette ran a tiny paragraph on page 4 about Eddie's tragic accident, describing it as a case where the elderly man apparently fell in the crosswalk and sustained fatal injuries. No mention of a vehicle, no call for witnesses, no investigation needed. Just an old man who mysteriously died alone in the street, according to the official story. The cover-up became obvious over the next few days, but what scared me most was how seamlessly it all worked. Eddie's funeral was held that Friday, and the Ashworth family made a big show of attending, with Vincent giving a touching speech about community loss, and Catherine presenting Eddie's sister with a generous donation to help with funeral expenses. Nathaniel was there too, looking appropriately somber in his black suit, playing the role of the grieving young citizen. But I noticed things others didn't, like how Nathaniel kept glancing around nervously, how his usually perfect hair looked unwashed, and most telling of all, the small bandage on his forehead that he kept touching unconsciously. When I mentioned to my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, that I'd witnessed the hit and run, she looked at me strangely and said she'd heard Eddie had simply collapsed from a heart attack. The official story was already spreading through town like wildfire, and anyone who suggested otherwise was politely but firmly corrected. The first warning came exactly 1 week after Eddie's death. I was opening the store on a Thursday morning when I found a plain manila envelope slipped under the door. Inside was a single photograph, a picture of me taken through the store window on the night of the accident, talking to Deputy Rodriguez. Written on the back in neat handwriting were the words, "Some things are better left forgotten." There was no signature, no return address, nothing to indicate who had sent it. My first instinct was to take it straight to the police, but then I remembered Chief Williams' nervous glances and Deputy Rodriguez's uncomfortable silence. If the police were part of this cover-up, going to them would only make things worse. I spent that entire day jumping at every customer who walked through the door, analyzing every face for signs of threat or surveillance. The second warning was more direct. The following Monday, I came home from classes to find my apartment door slightly ajar. Nothing was missing, but everything had been subtly moved. Books rearranged on shelves, clothes folded differently in drawers, even my toothbrush turned in a different direction. It was like someone had gone through every inch of my life with surgical precision, leaving just enough evidence to let me know they'd been there without actually taking anything. On my kitchen table was another envelope, this one containing a printout of my class schedule, my work schedule, and even my bank account balance. The message was crystal clear. "We know everything about you, your routines, your vulnerabilities." The note this time read, "Curiosity killed more than just cats." I barely slept that night, checking the locks on my door and windows every few minutes, knowing that if they wanted to get in, a few cheap locks wouldn't stop them. Things escalated when I made the mistake of confiding in my coworker, Jamie Walsh, during our shift change the next evening. Jamie had worked at Murphy's for 3 years and knew all the local gossip, so I thought maybe she'd have some insight into the Ashworth family's influence. When I told her about the strange events surrounding Eddie's death, her face went completely pale. She kept glancing toward the windows like someone might be watching us, then pulled me into the back storage room and whispered that her cousin Tommy worked at the auto body shop 2 towns over. According to Tommy, they'd gotten a rush job the night Eddie died, a silver Mustang with massive front-end damage that they were paid triple rate to repair overnight. No questions asked. But here's the kicker. The next morning, different guys came to pick up the car, and Tommy was told to forget he'd ever seen it. Jamie begged me to drop the whole thing, saying the Ashworths had destroyed people for far less than what I was digging into. The third warning came in the form of a job offer. Vincent Ashworth himself walked into Murphy's corner store the following Wednesday, dressed in his expensive suit and wearing that politician's smile that never reached his eyes. He browsed around for a few minutes, making small talk about the weather and the upcoming high school graduation, before casually mentioning that his lumber mill was hiring for a night security position. The pay was double what I made at the store, full benefits, and they were specifically looking for trustworthy young men who understood the value of discretion. When I politely declined, saying I needed to focus on my studies, his smile faltered just slightly. He leaned across the counter and said in a voice so quiet I almost missed it, "Sometimes opportunities like this don't come around twice. It would be unfortunate for a bright young man like yourself to miss out due to poor judgment." The way he emphasized those last two words made every nerve in my body scream danger. After he left, I noticed the black Escalade parked across the street for the next hour, Vincent just sitting there, watching the store. That night, I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of going home to my apartment, I drove to my Aunt Linda's house in Harrisburg, about 40 miles away. I called in sick to work and told my college professors I had a family emergency. For 3 days, I stayed away from Pine Ridge, trying to figure out my next move. During that time, Jamie called me in tears. She'd been fired from Murphy's for stealing from the register, a completely fabricated charge that everyone knew was false, but nobody would speak up about. Worse, her cousin Tommy had been let go from the auto body shop for unreliable attendance, and when he tried to apply for other jobs, somehow every potential employer already knew he was untrustworthy. The message was clear. Talking about the Ashworth family's business came with severe consequences, and they had the power to destroy people's livelihoods across multiple towns. When I finally returned to Pine Ridge, everything felt different. People who used to chat with me at the store now avoided eye contact. My landlord, Mr. Fitzgerald, mentioned that he'd had inquiries about my lease and suggested I might be happier somewhere else. Even my professors at the community college seemed distant, and I heard through the grapevine that someone had been asking questions about my grades and attendance. The Ashworths had turned me into a pariah without even making any public accusations. They'd simply made it known through their network of influence that I was trouble, and the entire community had responded accordingly. The most chilling moment came when I ran into Nathaniel at the grocery store. He was with a group of his football buddies, and when he saw me, he walked right up and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Hey, aren't you that guy who's been spreading weird conspiracy theories about my family?" His friends laughed, but there was nothing funny about the cold calculation in his eyes as he stared at me. The final warning was the most terrifying. I came home from my last shift at Murphy's. I'd been essentially forced to quit when my hours were cut to almost nothing. To find my car windshield completely shattered, not cracked, not damaged, but systematically destroyed as if someone had taken a hammer to every square inch of glass. Lying on my driver's seat was a newspaper clipping about a young man from a neighboring county who died in a tragic single-car accident after losing control on a curve he'd driven safely hundreds of times before. The victim's name was highlighted in yellow marker. When I called the police to report the vandalism, Deputy Rodriguez showed up and barely glanced at the damage before suggesting that maybe I'd been driving too aggressively and hit some rocks. He filled out a report but made it clear that nothing would come of it. That night, I heard footsteps on the stairs outside my apartment at 2 a.m., 3 a.m., and 4 a.m., slow, deliberate steps that stopped right outside my door for several minutes before retreating. I lasted exactly one more week before I broke. The constant surveillance, the social isolation, the threats both subtle and direct. It was psychological warfare designed to either buy my silence or drive me completely out of town. When I received an acceptance letter from a state university 3 hours away, along with a mysterious scholarship that covered full tuition and housing, I knew it was time to go. The scholarship paperwork was signed by Catherine Ashworth in her capacity as chairwoman of the Pine Ridge Youth Education Foundation, a foundation I'd never heard of before and couldn't find any other record of online. The message was crystal clear. Take this generous offer to start fresh somewhere else, or face increasingly severe consequences for staying. I packed everything I owned into my car that same day, left my keys with Mr. Fitzgerald, and drove away from Pine Ridge without looking back. I never filed any reports with outside authorities, never contacted state police or journalists. The Ashworths had taught me exactly how far their reach extended, and I wasn't brave enough to test those limits any further. The summer of 2017 changed everything about how I see my hometown. I was 16, working part-time at my uncle's hardware store in Millbrook, Montana, population barely pushing 3,000. You know the type of place. One main street, everybody's business is everybody's business, and the biggest excitement usually comes from the annual Harvest Festival. My best friend Caleb and I had grown up there, spent our whole lives hearing the same warning from every adult we knew. Stay away from the woods past the old railroad tracks. Nobody ever explained why, just gave us that look that meant the conversation was over. That particular Thursday started like any other. I'd finished my shift around 4 and Caleb picked me up in his beat-up Chevy. We were supposed to head to his place to play video games, but as we passed St. Joseph's Church, we noticed something strange. Behind the church, near the maintenance shed that backed up against those forbidden woods, we saw Father Morrison's car parked at an odd angle. What caught our attention wasn't just the car, it was the fact that he'd covered his license plate with a black cloth. Caleb and I exchanged glances, and without saying a word, he pulled into the grocery store parking lot across the street. Something was happening, and after 16 years of being told to mind our own business, our curiosity finally won. We waited until the sun started dipping behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the churchyard. The maintenance shed had a broken fence section on the side. Caleb and I had discovered it years ago during a game of hide-and-seek after Sunday school. We slipped through easily, keeping low behind the overgrown hedges that lined the property. The air felt heavier back there, thick with the smell of damp earth and something else I couldn't place, like copper pennies left in the rain. As we crept closer to the tree line, we heard it. A low humming sound, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from deeper in the woods. Not singing exactly, more like a chant, dozens of voices blending together in a pattern that made my skin prickle. The path into the woods was more worn than it should have been for a place nobody was supposed to go. Fresh tire tracks cut through the mud, and someone had recently trimmed back the branches that would have blocked the way. Caleb grabbed my arm when we saw the first lantern, an old-fashioned oil lamp hanging from a tree branch, casting flickering shadows that danced between the pines. Then we saw another, and another, creating a trail of light leading deeper into the darkness. We could hear car doors closing somewhere ahead, muffled voices giving instructions. My mouth went dry as I recognized Mrs. Anderson's distinctive laugh, the same woman who'd been my third-grade teacher, who always brought cookies to church socials and volunteered at the food bank. Whatever was happening back here, the people we'd trusted our whole lives were part of it. We followed the lantern trail for maybe 200 yards, staying just outside the pools of light, using the thick pine trunks for cover. The chanting grew louder, and now we could make out individual words, though they weren't in English or any language I recognized. The syllables felt ancient, guttural, like they were being pulled from somewhere deep in the speakers' chests. Through the trees ahead, we saw a clearing lit by dozens more lanterns arranged in a perfect circle. In the center stood a stone structure I'd never seen before, a flat altar about waist-high, covered in symbols that seemed to writhe in the flickering light. Around it, at least 30 people stood in robes the color of dried blood, their faces hidden behind masks that looked handmade, each one unique. Some had antlers attached, others featured grotesque painted expressions with too many eyes or mouths in the wrong places. The crowd parted, and 3 figures emerged from the group carrying something between them. At first, I thought it was a mannequin or a scarecrow, the way it hung limp between their hands. But then it moved, just slightly, and I realized with a sick jolt that it was a person, dressed in white, their head covered with a burlap sack. They placed the figure on the altar, and the chanting stopped so abruptly that the silence felt like a physical weight pressing down on us. One of the robed figures stepped forward, pulling an ornate wooden box from beneath their robes. Even from our hiding spot 50 feet away, I could see their hands trembling with excitement as they opened it. Inside, something gleamed silver in the lantern light, a blade unlike anything I'd seen in my uncle's store, curved and inscribed with the same writhing symbols that covered the altar. The leader raised the blade high, and the crowd resumed their chant, louder now, almost frantic. But what happened next wasn't what I expected. Instead of violence, the leader used the blade to cut away the burlap sack, revealing a young woman's face, maybe early 20s, with dark hair plastered to her forehead with sweat. She wasn't screaming or struggling. Her eyes were wide open but vacant, like she was looking at something none of us could see. The leader spoke in English for the first time, his voice booming across the clearing. "Rebecca Thorne, you have been chosen to carry our burden, to walk between worlds as we have walked, to see as we have seen." The woman's lips moved, repeating words I couldn't hear, and then something impossible happened. The symbols on the altar began to glow, faint at first, then brighter, casting strange shadows that didn't match the direction of the lantern light. The air in the clearing changed, became dense and electric, like the moments before a thunderstorm. The masked figures swayed in unison, and I noticed something that made my stomach clench. One of them was wearing a high school class ring on their finger, the same sapphire blue as mine. That's when Caleb accidentally stepped on a dry branch, the crack echoing like a gunshot in the strange silence between chants. Every single masked face turned in our direction at once, a synchronized movement that looked rehearsed, inhuman. The leader lowered the blade and spoke again, his voice carrying clearly through the trees. "Brothers and sisters, it seems we have witnesses to our covenant." Several figures began moving toward the edge of the clearing, their robes rustling against the undergrowth. Caleb and I didn't need to discuss what came next. We ran like we'd never run before, crashing through the woods with no thought for stealth, lantern light dancing crazily in our peripheral vision as our pursuers gave chase. Branches tore at our clothes and faces as we stumbled through the darkness, guided only by memory and panic. Behind us, I could hear them crashing through the underbrush, their chanting replaced by sharp commands and coordinates, like they were hunting deer. We burst out of the tree line near the railroad tracks, and I've never been so grateful to see rusted metal in my life. Caleb's truck was still parked at the grocery store, seemingly miles away across open ground. We had no choice but to sprint for it, our legs burning, lungs screaming for air. I could hear car engines starting up in the distance. They were going to cut us off at the road. That's when old Mr. Henley stepped out from behind the church dumpster, still wearing his janitor's overalls, and I thought we were done for. But instead of grabbing us, he pointed to his maintenance van and hissed, "Get in, boys, now!" We didn't question it, just dove into the back of the van among the mops and cleaning supplies. Mr. Henley peeled out of the parking lot, taking back roads I didn't even know existed, constantly checking his mirrors. "You shouldn't have seen that," he kept muttering, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. 40 years I've been keeping kids away from those woods. 40 years. He drove us to the town limits and pulled over near the interstate on-ramp. His hands shook as he turned to face us, and I'll never forget what he said. "You got two choices, boys. You can leave town tonight and never come back, never speak of what you saw. Or you can stay, keep your mouth shut and pray they decide you're more useful alive. They've been doing this since before your grandparents were born, bringing in outsiders, making them see things that ain't meant to be seen. That girl tonight, she'll be running the bank by next month, won't remember her old life, and she'll be one of them." Caleb and I looked at each other in that van, both thinking about our families, our lives, everything we'd ever known. How could we leave? But how could we stay, knowing what happened in those woods? Mr. Henley gave us $50 each from his wallet and a piece of paper with a phone number. "My brother lives in Colorado," he said. "He got out in '82 after he saw what I'm guessing you saw tonight. Call him if you run, he'll help." We chose to run that night, called our parents from a gas station 2 states away with some story about a road trip gone wrong. The official story became that we'd stolen Caleb's truck and gone joyriding. Got scared about getting in trouble. Our families were furious, but they were also relieved we were safe. We never went back to Millbrook, enrolled in new schools, built new lives. But we kept tabs on our hometown through social media and news sites, watching for signs. 6 months later, I found an article in the Millbrook Gazette online. Rebecca Thorne, new vice president of First National Bank, youngest executive in the bank's history. The photo showed her smiling at a ribbon-cutting ceremony, surrounded by familiar faces including Father Morrison and Mrs. Anderson. Her eyes looked normal in the picture, but something about her smile reminded me of those masks in the woods. Caleb found more articles over the years, outsiders moving to Millbrook and quickly rising to prominent positions, the town's unusual prosperity despite the declining rural economy, the fact that no major chains or developers could ever seem to get permits to build there. We finally understood why everyone avoided those woods, why the whole town seemed to operate on unspoken rules. They weren't keeping us out to protect us, they were protecting their secret, their way of maintaining control. Mr. Henley still texts us sometimes, always the same message. Stay away, they remember, and we do. But sometimes I wake up at night, wondering about all the kids who didn't stumble onto that ritual, who grew up and stayed, who maybe got invited to put on a mask of their own. I wonder if they ever stood in that circle, chanting in that ancient language, welcoming the next outsider into something older and darker than anything that should exist in small-town America. Running at night was my thing, always had been since college. Living in Seabrook, this tiny coastal town in Maine where everyone knows everyone, meant the streets were dead quiet after 9 p.m. Perfect for someone like me who worked 12-hour shifts at the hospital and could only find time to exercise when the rest of the world was settling down for the night. At 28, I was in the best shape of my life, training for the Boston Marathon, and those late-night runs through our sleepy neighborhood had become sacred to me. The salty ocean breeze, the rhythmic sound of my sneakers hitting the pavement, the way streetlights created these perfect pools of orange light every 50 feet. It was meditative, almost spiritual. I'd been doing this routine for 3 years straight, same route every time. Down Maple Avenue, around the Harbor Loop, back through the residential streets where Victorian houses sat like silent guardians in the darkness. The first time I saw the pickup truck, it was a Wednesday night in November 2021, unseasonably warm for that time of year. I was about 2 miles into my usual 5-mile route when I noticed headlights in my peripheral vision, moving unusually slow for that stretch of road. When I glanced over, I saw this beat-up Ford, maybe from the early 2000s, dark blue or black, hard to tell in the dim light. What struck me as odd was how it seemed to be keeping pace with me, crawling along at maybe 10 miles per hour. The driver's side was facing away from me, so I couldn't make out who was behind the wheel, but something about the way it moved felt deliberate, calculated. I shrugged it off, figuring it was probably just someone lost, or maybe having car trouble. Small towns breed paranoia sometimes, and I didn't want to be one of those people who saw danger in every shadow. By the time I rounded the corner onto Harbor Street, the truck had disappeared, and I finished my run without giving it another thought. The next night, Thursday, I was feeling particularly energetic after a surprisingly calm shift in the ER. I'd changed into my favorite running gear, these bright yellow reflective shorts that my sister Melissa always teased me about, saying I looked like a human traffic cone, and headed out around 10:30 p.m. The temperature had dropped significantly, and my breath was creating these small puffs of vapor that disappeared as quickly as they formed. I was maybe a mile and a half into my run, just passing the old lighthouse that hadn't worked in decades, when I heard the familiar rumble of a diesel engine behind me. My heart rate was already elevated from running, but something made me turn around. There it was again, the same pickup truck moving at that same unnaturally slow pace. This time, though, I noticed the headlights were completely off. Just the running lights were on, these dim amber dots that barely illuminated anything. The truck was maybe 30 yards behind me, and in the faint glow of the streetlight, I could make out a silhouette in the driver's seat, but the details were lost in shadow. I picked up my pace slightly, not wanting to seem obvious about it, and took a right turn onto Birch Lane, a route I sometimes used but wasn't part of my usual pattern. The truck followed. My chest tightened, and I could feel my breathing becoming more labored, though I wasn't sure if it was from the increased speed or the growing anxiety. Birch Lane was darker than the main roads, With fewer streetlights and houses set back further from the road behind thick pine trees, the truck maintained its distance, never getting closer but never falling behind either. When I reached the end of Birch Lane, I had to make a choice. Turn left toward the harbor and continue my usual route, or turn right toward the more populated part of town where the 24-hour diner and gas station provided some semblance of civilization. I chose right, telling myself I was just being cautious, not scared. The truck continued straight, disappearing into the network of back roads that led to the older part of town, where the fishermen lived in weather-beaten houses that looked like they'd been there since before I was born. Friday night came, and I almost didn't go out. I'd spent the entire day replaying those two encounters in my head, trying to convince myself it was just coincidence. Maybe it was someone who worked late shifts like me, or perhaps a night owl who suffered from insomnia and drove around to clear their head. I'd done stranger things to cope with stress, but by 10 p.m., cabin fever was setting in, and I felt like I was letting some anonymous creep control my life. I laced up my running shoes with more determination than usual, grabbed my phone, and made sure it was fully charged, just in case. The air was crisp and clean, carrying that distinctive smell of salt water and seaweed that I'd grown to love about coastal living. I started my run with a modified route, beginning on Oak Street instead of my usual Maple Avenue, hoping to throw off any potential followers. For the first 20 minutes, everything seemed normal. A few cars passed by, their occupants probably wondering what kind of crazy person runs in near-freezing temperatures wearing shorts and a tank top. Then I saw it parked, not moving this time, but sitting perfectly still under a burned-out streetlight near the entrance to Sunset Park. The same pickup truck, engine running. I could see the exhaust creating a small cloud in the cold air. The driver had positioned the vehicle so that it was facing the direction I was coming from, like they'd been waiting. My pace slowed involuntarily as I approached, and I could feel every muscle in my body tensing up. The windshield was too tinted, and the angle too awkward for me to make out any details about the person inside, but I had the distinct feeling of being watched, studied, analyzed. As I jogged past, trying to appear nonchalant while my pulse hammered in my ears, the truck's engine revved once, not loud enough to wake the neighborhood, but deliberate enough that I knew it was meant for me. I didn't look back, but I could hear the vehicle pulling away from the curb and beginning to follow me again, maintaining that same eerie, measured distance. Saturday night, I broke my own rules and called my friend Jessica before heading out. She lived about 20 minutes away in the next town over, but I needed someone to know where I was going and when to expect me back. "You sure you want to go out there alone?" she asked, and I could hear the concern in her voice. "Maybe skip tonight and go to the gym tomorrow instead." But I was stubborn, and the thought of hiding inside my apartment felt like surrendering to whoever was playing these games with me. I promised to text her every 15 minutes and started my run earlier than usual, 9:45 p.m. instead of my typical 10:30. The streets felt different somehow, like the familiar neighborhood I'd been running through for years had transformed into something foreign and threatening. Even the houses looked menacing, their dark windows staring down at me like empty eye sockets. I made it about 10 minutes before the truck appeared, but this time it was different. Instead of following behind me, it was coming from the opposite direction, headlights on full beam, moving slowly toward me like some kind of predator stalking its prey. When we were about 50 feet apart, the truck suddenly swerved across the center line, forcing me to jump onto the sidewalk and nearly trip over a fire hydrant that I'd passed hundreds of times before, but somehow hadn't seen in the blinding glare of those headlights. The driver didn't stop, didn't even slow down after the near miss, just continued down the street as if nothing had happened. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst, and my legs were shaking, not from exertion, but from pure adrenaline and fear. I stood there on the sidewalk for what felt like an eternity, trying to catch my breath and process what had just occurred. This wasn't random anymore. This wasn't someone who happened to be driving around at the same time I was running. This was intentional, calculated, and escalating. I pulled out my phone to text Jessica, but my fingers were trembling so badly that I kept hitting the wrong keys. When I finally managed to type out "truck tried to hit me," autocorrect changed it to something nonsensical, and I had to start over 3 times before sending a coherent message. Sunday night was when everything went completely sideways. I'd spent the entire weekend debating whether to call the police, but what would I tell them? A truck has been driving around while I'm jogging? Someone almost hit me but didn't actually make contact? It sounded ridiculous even in my own head, and I knew how these things went in small towns. They'd probably just tell me to run during daylight hours and leave it at that. Against my better judgment, I decided to go out one more time, but with a plan. I'd mapped out a route that would take me past the police station, through the most well-lit areas of town, and I'd carry pepper spray that I'd bought that afternoon from the hardware store. The clerk, an older gentleman named Burton who'd lived in Seabrook his entire life, gave me a knowing look when I purchased it. "Been having some trouble, honey?" he asked, and I wondered if he'd heard something or if my paranoia was just that obvious. I assured him it was just for general safety, but his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. The truck was waiting for me before I even made it 3 blocks from my apartment. This time it was parked at the end of my street, positioned so that I had to pass directly by it to reach any of the main roads. As I approached, trying to project confidence I didn't feel, the driver's side window rolled down about halfway. I couldn't see a face in the darkness, just the faint outline of someone sitting behind the wheel, but I could feel eyes tracking my every movement. The engine was running rough, making this irregular puttering sound that suggested the vehicle was probably older and more beat up than it had appeared from a distance. When I was directly alongside the truck, maybe 6 feet away, a voice called out, gravelly, definitely male, with an accent I couldn't quite place. "Nice night for a run," he said, and there was something in the tone that made my skin crawl. Not threatening exactly, but wrong somehow, like he was savoring words that had a different meaning to him than they would to anyone else. I didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge that I'd heard him, just kept moving with my pepper spray clutched in my right hand, thumb positioned over the trigger mechanism. What happened next still gives me nightmares. I'd made it maybe half a mile when I heard the truck's engine roar to life behind me, but instead of that slow, stalking pace I'd grown accustomed to, it was accelerating fast. I turned around just in time to see the headlights bearing down on me, the vehicle swerving erratically like the driver was either drunk or had finally decided to stop playing games. There was no sidewalk on this stretch of Ocean View Road, just a narrow shoulder that dropped off into a drainage ditch filled with brambles and God knows what else. I had maybe 2 seconds to react, and instinct took over where rational thought failed. I dove toward the ditch, landing hard on my left shoulder and rolling through a tangle of thorny bushes that tore at my running clothes and scraped lines of fire across my arms and legs. The truck roared past, so close that I could smell the exhaust and feel the displacement of air as it missed me by inches. But then, instead of continuing down the road, it slammed on the brakes about 50 yards ahead, tires squealing against the asphalt in a way that seemed to echo off every house in the neighborhood. The driver threw the truck into reverse and started backing up toward me, headlights illuminating my hiding spot in the ditch like a spotlight on a stage. I realized with growing horror that this wasn't just harassment anymore. This person was actively trying to hurt me, maybe kill me. My phone had flown out of my hand during the dive, and I could see it lying in the middle of the road, the screen cracked but still glowing with Jessica's unanswered messages. The truck stopped directly above where I was crouched, engine idling, and I heard the driver's side door creak open. Heavy footsteps on gravel, moving slowly, deliberately, like someone who had all the time in the world and knew their prey wasn't going anywhere. I held my breath and pressed myself deeper into the brambles, feeling thorns dig into my back through my torn shirt, and gripped the pepper spray so tightly that my knuckles ached. The footsteps stopped right at the edge of the road, maybe 10 feet from where I was hiding, and I heard that same gravelly voice from before, but closer now, almost conversational. "I know you're down there, sweetheart. Why don't you come on up and we can have ourselves a proper chat?" That's when I heard the most beautiful sound in the world, another car approaching from the direction of town. The footsteps above me suddenly quickened, moving back toward the truck, and I heard the door slam shut just as a pair of headlights swept across the scene. It was old Mr. Henshaw from the bait shop, driving his ancient Buick home from his weekly poker game at the VFW hall. He must have seen my phone lying in the road because he stopped and got out calling my name. Apparently, he'd recognized me from all those nights I'd jogged past his shop. The pickup truck was already disappearing around the bend, taillights fading into the darkness like red eyes closing. Mr. Henshaw helped me out of the ditch, and when he saw the state I was in, clothes torn, covered in scratches, shaking like a leaf, he didn't ask questions, just loaded me into his car and drove straight to the police station. They found the truck 2 days later, abandoned in a field about 15 miles outside town. It had been reported stolen 3 weeks earlier from a farm in Vermont. They never caught whoever was driving it, and the case went cold after a few months. I moved to Boston 6 weeks later, got a job at Mass General, and haven't been for a nighttime run since. Sometimes I wonder if he's still out there, cruising dark roads in another stolen truck, waiting for another woman who thinks she's safe in her small town bubble. But I try not to think about it too much. Some questions are better left unanswered. The divorce papers were still warm in my hands when Uncle Bill called about the hardware store. Kevin Matthews here, and at 34 years old, I thought I had life figured out until everything crumbled in the span of 6 months. The marriage fell apart, the house got sold, and suddenly I was seeing my kids Alex and Sophie only every other weekend instead of tucking them in every night. Uncle Bill's offer to manage his little hardware store in Riverside seemed like divine intervention at the time. The town was small enough that I could afford a decent place, and the work seemed honest. No corporate politics, no backstabbing co-workers, just helping folks find the right screws and paint colors. I packed up my beat-up Chevy Silverado and drove the 8 hours from Phoenix with nothing but clothes, a coffee maker, and hoped that a fresh start would heal the wounds my ex-wife had left behind. The first few weeks at Riverside Hardware were exactly what I needed. The store sat on Main Street, wedged between Betty's Diner and an old barbershop that still had the spinning pole out front. The building itself was from the 1940s, with creaky wooden floors and high ceilings lined with fluorescent lights that hummed constantly. Uncle Bill had done well over the decades. The place was organized, well-stocked, and had a loyal customer base of contractors, farmers, and weekend DIY warriors. I'd open at 7 a.m. sharp, make coffee in the little back office, and spend my days helping people solve their problems with the right tools. Mrs. Gonzalez needed new hinges for her chicken coop. Old Pete wanted advice on fixing his irrigation system, and the local contractors knew I'd give them fair prices on bulk orders. For the first time since the divorce, I felt useful again, like I was actually making a difference in people's lives instead of just pushing papers around a desk. That's when I first noticed him. Tall, maybe 6'3", with stringy brown hair that always looked like he'd just rolled out of bed, and clothes that hung off his lanky frame like they belonged to someone else. He'd wander in around 10 a.m. most days, never buying anything, just walking the aisles with this weird shuffle step while talking to himself under his breath. The guy had these pale blue eyes that never seemed to focus on anything specific, and when he smiled, which was often, it showed off teeth that were yellowed and crooked. He'd pick up random items, examine them like they were ancient artifacts, then put them back in completely wrong places. I'd find screwdrivers in the paint section, electrical tape mixed in with the plumbing supplies, and garden hoses coiled up in aisle 3 where the hand tools belonged. At first I thought he was just lonely, or maybe had some kind of mental condition, so I'd politely ask if he needed help finding anything. He'd always respond with this rambling story about how he was planning a big project or getting ready for something special, but never gave any details that made sense. The conversations got stranger as weeks went by. He'd corner me by the cash register and talk for 20-30 minutes straight about completely random stuff. How the government was putting chemicals in the water supply, how his neighbor's dog was actually a spy, how the hardware store used to be built on an old cemetery. His voice had this nasally quality that made every word sound like a complaint, and he'd stand just a little too close, invading my personal space while his breath smelled like stale cigarettes and something metallic. Other customers would come in, see him monopolizing my time, and either wait impatiently or just leave altogether. I started losing business because people didn't want to deal with the weird guy who treated my store like his personal social club. The final straw came on a Friday afternoon when he spent 45 minutes telling me about how he'd been watching the patterns in my daily routine and knew exactly when I opened, when I took lunch, and when I locked up. The way he said it, with that unsettling grin spreading across his face, made every alarm bell in my head start ringing. The next Monday, I decided enough was enough. When he shuffled through the front door at his usual time, I was ready with a speech I'd practiced all weekend. I approached him calmly, keeping my voice friendly but firm, and explained that while he was welcome to browse, I needed paying customers to have priority access to my time and assistance. I told him that if he wasn't planning to make a purchase, I'd appreciate it if he could keep his visits shorter, so I could focus on running the business. His reaction was immediate and unsettling. Those pale eyes narrowed into slits, and his perpetual grin vanished completely. For about 10 seconds, he just stared at me with this cold, calculating expression that made my skin crawl. Then, without saying a single word, he turned around and walked out, letting the door slam so hard that it rattled the glass and made several customers look up in alarm. I thought I'd handled it well, maybe even felt a little proud that I'd finally stood up for myself and my business. The rest of that day was peaceful, productive even, with regular customers commenting on how nice it was to shop without that strange fellow lurking around. That night, the phone started ringing. The first call came at 11:47 p.m. I remember the exact time because I was lying in bed, finally drifting off to sleep in my little rental house 3 blocks from the store. No voice on the other end, just heavy breathing that went on for maybe 30 seconds before the line went dead. I figured it was a wrong number, or maybe some teenager playing pranks, so I unplugged the phone and went back to sleep. But when I plugged it back in the next morning, there were 6 missed calls from unknown numbers, all received between midnight and 4 a.m. The pattern continued for 3 straight nights. Silent calls, heavy breathing, sometimes whispered words I couldn't quite make out, but sounded vaguely threatening. By Thursday, I was exhausted and paranoid, jumping every time the phone rang during business hours. I started letting calls go to the answering machine first, screening each one before picking up, but that meant potentially missing legitimate customers who needed help or wanted to place orders. The worst part was that I knew, deep in my gut, that it was him, the weird guy I'd politely asked to leave me alone. Friday morning brought a new level of creepiness. When I arrived at the store to open up, there was a folded piece of paper stuck under the front door, wedged so tightly that I had to yank it free. The paper was cheap notebook paper, the kind kids use in school, and written in red ink were the words, "You made a mistake," in all capital letters. The handwriting was shaky and uneven, like someone had written it while their hand was trembling with rage or excitement. Below that, in smaller letters, was my home address, not just the street name, but the exact house number, even though I'd never given that information to anyone at the store except Uncle Bill. My stomach churned as I realized this lunatic had been following me home, watching me, learning my routines just like he'd bragged about. I crumpled up the note and threw it in the trash, trying to convince myself it was just an empty threat from someone with too much time on their hands. But throughout that entire day, I kept glancing out the front windows, expecting to see his tall, lanky silhouette lurking across the street or peering around the corner of Betty's diner. Every customer who walked through the door made me tense up until I could see their face clearly. The weekend brought a brief respite since I was picking up Alex and Sophie for our scheduled time together. Having my kids around always made everything else fade into the background. We went to the movies, played mini golf, and spent Saturday night making s'mores in the backyard of my rental house while they told me about school and their friends. For those precious 2 days, I almost forgot about the strange man and his threats. But Sunday evening, after I dropped the kids back at their mom's place, I returned home to find my truck vandalized. All 4 tires had been slashed with something sharp, probably a knife or box cutter, leaving deep gashes that made them completely flat. Worse than that, someone had used a key or screwdriver to scratch symbols into the paint on both sides of the vehicle. The markings weren't random scratches. They were deliberate symbols that looked almost like crude drawings of eyes and what might have been a twisted face. The scratches went deep, right down to the metal, and would cost hundreds of dollars to repair. I called the police immediately, but Officer Davis, who responded, seemed more annoyed than concerned, taking a quick report and suggesting it was probably just kids being kids, even though I explained about the threatening note and phone calls. Monday morning arrived with another note under the store door, this one even more disturbing than the first. Same red ink, same shaky handwriting, but the message was longer and more specific. Nice kids you have. Alex likes chocolate ice cream. Sophie carries a purple backpack. My legs nearly gave out as I read those words. This psychopath had been watching my children, studying them, learning details about their lives that only someone who'd been following them closely would know. Alex did love chocolate ice cream. It was his favorite flavor, and he'd gotten a double scoop at the parlor just 2 days earlier during our weekend together. Sophie's backpack was indeed purple with little unicorn patches that she'd picked out herself for the new school year. The fact that this stranger knew these intimate details about my kids made me physically sick. I immediately called my ex-wife Janet, trying to keep my voice calm while explaining the situation and asking her to be extra careful about picking up the kids from school. She was skeptical at first, thinking I was being paranoid or trying to cause drama, but when I read her the exact contents of the note, her tone changed completely. We agreed that she'd drive them to and from school personally, instead of letting them take the bus, and that they'd stay inside during recess until we figured out what was going on. The harassment escalated throughout that week. More notes appeared under the door every single morning, each one containing increasingly detailed information about my daily life and my children's routines. He knew what time I got my coffee at Betty's Diner, which gas station I used, what groceries I bought, and even what TV shows I watched at night. Apparently, he'd been peering through my windows like some kind of deranged stalker. The phone calls became more frequent and aggressive, sometimes coming every hour with different voices whispering threats or just playing loud, distorted music that sounded like it was coming from some kind of horror movie soundtrack. I started sleeping with a baseball bat next to my bed and installed motion sensor lights around my house, but nothing made me feel safe anymore. The breaking point came on Friday when I discovered that someone had broken into the storage shed behind the hardware store. Nothing was stolen, but tools had been rearranged in bizarre patterns, and there was a crude drawing scratched into the wooden workbench, the same eye symbols that had been carved into my truck, but this time accompanied by what looked like stick figures of 2 small children. The message was clear. He could get to my kids anytime he wanted, and the police still seemed completely uninterested in taking my report seriously. That Saturday changed everything. I was at home around 2 p.m. when my phone rang, Janet's number on the caller ID. But when I answered, it wasn't Janet's voice. It was him, that nasally complaining tone I'd heard rambling in my store for weeks, except now it was cold and menacing. "Your kids are at Maple Park," he said slowly, like he was savoring each word. "Sophie's wearing her pink dress today. Alex has his new sneakers on. They're playing on the swings right now, but parks can be dangerous places. Accidents happen all the time." The line went dead before I could respond. I immediately called Janet back, but it went straight to voicemail. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely think straight as I grabbed my keys and raced to Maple Park, which was only 5 minutes from Janet's house. When I arrived, I spotted my kids immediately. They were exactly where he said they'd be, wearing exactly what he'd described, playing on the swing set while Janet sat on a nearby bench, scrolling through her phone. I ran over and scooped them both up in a bear hug, trying to appear calm while scanning the park for any sign of the tall, lanky figure who'd been terrorizing us. Janet looked confused and annoyed when I explained what had happened, but agreed to pack up and head home immediately. As we walked back to the parking lot, I noticed a beat-up gray sedan parked across the street with someone sitting in the driver's seat, but the sun glare on the windshield made it impossible to see who it was. That night, I made a decision that probably saved our lives. Instead of going to the police again, I called my old Army buddy, Jake Thompson, who now worked private security in Dallas. Jake listened to everything without interruption, then told me to pack a bag and get out of town immediately while he drove up to help me deal with the situation. "This isn't some harmless weirdo," he said. "This is a predator, and he's escalating. You need to disappear for a while." I spent the rest of the night gathering evidence, all the threatening notes, photos of my vandalized truck, recordings of the harassing phone calls, and a detailed timeline of everything that had happened. By Sunday morning, Jake had arrived with 2 other guys from his security company, all of them armed and experienced in dealing with dangerous stalkers. While I took the kids to stay with Janet's parents in another state, Jake and his team set up surveillance around the hardware store and my house. It took them less than 48 hours to catch the guy red-handed. Turns out his name was Donald Kemp, a 41-year-old unemployed mechanic with a history of stalking and harassment charges in 3 different states. He'd been living in a trailer park outside of town, and when they searched his place, they found hundreds of photos of me, my kids, and other local families he'd been watching. The police finally took it seriously when Jake presented them with video evidence of Kemp breaking into my storage shed, and photos of the disturbing shrine he'd built in his trailer using pictures of my children. He was arrested and eventually sentenced to 5 years in prison for stalking, harassment, and making terroristic threats. I moved back to Pine Hill after college, mostly because my mom was going through a rough patch with her health. It's the kind of place where everyone knows what car you drive, what you were like in high school, and unfortunately, where people assume you haven't changed at all. That's probably why I agreed to meet up with Connor Brighton after he messaged me out of nowhere. We hadn't spoken since sophomore year, but he acted like we were old friends. Said he'd seen me around and figured it'd be nice to catch up. Like old times, he said. It felt harmless enough. We made plans to meet at the small park near the high school baseball field, just past the faded bleachers and the broken vending machine that's somehow still standing. It was a Thursday afternoon, early spring, still cold enough for a jacket but sunny enough to pretend it wasn't. Connor was already waiting when I parked. He was leaning against that same rusted bench we used to sit on before practice, wearing a Carhartt jacket and beat-up Vans. He smiled like he hadn't aged a day, even though there was something a little worn in his face I didn't remember. We talked about nothing at first. Teachers who'd retired, people who'd left town, people who never did. I noticed he kept glancing at my car keys, which I'd tucked into the sleeve of my hoodie. Just a twitch of the eye each time I moved them. It didn't seem important at the time. After a while, he pulled a joint from his jacket and held it out like it was no big deal. I hesitated. I don't smoke much anymore. But he laughed and said it was just for nostalgia. I don't know what possessed me to go along with it. Maybe I wanted to shake the stiffness of coming home. Maybe I didn't want to seem stuck up. We sat on that bench, and I took maybe 3 puffs. Not deep ones either, but it hit me hard. Way too hard. Within minutes, the trees started to tilt slightly. The edges of my vision pulsed like I was looking through fogged glass. My tongue felt thick, like I'd chewed on cotton. Something was wrong. This wasn't normal weed. I looked at him, but he was just watching me. Too still. I tried to stand up, but my knees weren't listening. My breath came out shallow, as if the air was heavier. Connor stood and put a hand on my back, gently guiding me up. "Let me take you home," he said. "You shouldn't drive like this." I didn't want him touching me. I couldn't even string that sentence together in my head, much less say it out loud. I nodded without meaning to. He grabbed my keys before I could stop him, leading me toward my car like a kid helping someone drunk out of a bar. Everything in me screamed that this wasn't okay, but my body moved like it was underwater. The moment he opened the driver's side door and helped me into the passenger seat, I felt trapped. The car smelled faintly like my perfume and the vanilla air freshener I always used, but it felt unfamiliar now, like I didn't belong in my own space. Connor adjusted the seat without asking and pulled out of the lot without hesitation. I kept trying to focus on landmarks, street signs, anything that would tell me where we were going, but my vision wouldn't cooperate. The world outside smeared together like watercolors left out in the rain. I wasn't sure if we were heading toward my neighborhood or somewhere completely different. He kept the windows up, locked the doors with a firm click as soon as we hit the first stop sign. I heard it. I knew I did. My fingers fumbled with the handle beside me, but I couldn't seem to grip it properly. My voice came out in pieces when I tried to say, "This isn't the way." Connor glanced at me and gave a casual shrug, like we were just taking a different route. "Shorter this way," he muttered. That was the moment something in my gut shifted, even through the haze. Whatever this was, it wasn't casual, it wasn't normal, and I needed to get out, now. I tried turning down the window, but he must have disabled the controls. I looked down at my phone, but it wasn't in my pocket. I never leave the house without it. I remembered having it in my hand when I walked into the park. Had I set it on the bench? Did I drop it? Connor noticed me checking my hoodie and said, "You dropped it back there." "I grabbed it for you." But he didn't offer to hand it over. That's when the fear started to take shape, not just as a fog, but as a solid, icy thread winding its way up my spine. I needed to think clearly, but my head felt like it was packed with wool. He made a sharp right turn onto a narrow road I didn't recognize. No signs, no houses, just old pines lining both sides, casting long shadows over cracked pavement. My breathing sped up, but I kept it quiet. I thought if I panicked, I'd lose what little control I had. I told him I felt sick and needed air. He ignored me, just stared ahead, both hands on the wheel, mouth pressed into a flat line. That look, I hadn't seen it in high school. It was new, focused, like he was driving towards something he'd already planned. I kept one hand on the seatbelt buckle, the other barely steadying myself against the door. The trees outside got denser, the road rougher. Whatever haze I was in, adrenaline was slicing through it just enough to let my instincts breathe. At a bend in the road, he slowed to take the corner, and I saw my chance. I unlatched the seatbelt and reached across my body to pull the door handle with everything I had. It gave. The door cracked open. The wind hit me like a slap, cold and loud. Before he could react, I pushed it open wider and threw myself out. The landing wasn't graceful. I scraped my knees hard and rolled into a patch of gravel. The air knocked out of me. The world spun, but I forced myself up and stumbled into the trees. I didn't hear him call my name. I didn't hear footsteps. Nothing. Just the idling sound of the car behind me, then the engine revving, and silence. I crouched behind a fallen log and waited, every muscle clenched, vision pulsing at the edges again. When I finally dared to look, the car was gone. Just tire marks and broken twigs where I'd fallen. I walked for what felt like hours before I reached a gas station with a flickering sign and a payphone that barely worked. A man behind the counter, middle-aged, heavy-set, wearing a Boise State hoodie, let me call my mom. I didn't explain much, just said I was in trouble and told her the address printed on a receipt I found by the register. She showed up with a sheriff's deputy. I gave a report, told them everything, as much as I could remember. They found my phone 2 days later, tossed in a dumpster outside a liquor store across town. Connor was never charged, said I was just too high and that I'd made it all up after falling. To this day, I don't fully understand what he gave me, or what would have happened if I hadn't jumped out when I did. I haven't smoked anything since. I haven't gone back to that park, and I don't answer old messages from people I barely remember. Pine Hill feels different now, smaller in the wrong way. The kind of place where someone can know your face, smile like a friend, and still be planning something else entirely. I moved out again a few months later, this time for good.